What if I told you that everything holding you back, procrastination, self-doubt, lack of motivation, isn't who you are, but simply how your brain has been wired? And there's one habit that, if you start doing it today, will reprogram your mind for relentless discipline. Not motivation, not hacks, actual rewiring. It's uncomfortable, it's simple, and it's the reason elite performers get more done in one day than most do in a week. If you want control over your mind instead of being controlled by it, keep watching. Discipline is not merely a matter of willpower or personality. It is fundamentally tied to how your brain regulates dopamine, the key neuromodulator involved in motivation, reward, and effort. When we repeatedly engage in behaviors that offer instant gratification, such as checking our phones, snacking without hunger, or binge-watching entertainment, we are effectively training our brain to expect frequent, low-effort dopamine spikes. Over time, this reduces the sensitivity of the dopamine system and increases the threshold required to feel motivated. This leads to a cycle where increasingly intense or novel stimuli are needed just to feel the same baseline level of drive or satisfaction. It becomes harder to focus on long-term goals or endure discomfort because the brain has been conditioned to prefer rapid, predictable hits of pleasure. As a result, the more we feed this cycle, the less capable we are of generating effort toward meaningful but challenging objectives. Rewiring this system starts by intentionally reducing or eliminating low-effort dopamine sources. This doesn't mean cutting out pleasure entirely, but recalibrating the reward system to value effort-based satisfaction over passive consumption. One of the most effective ways to restore healthy dopamine function is to engage in behaviors that elevate dopamine in a delayed or sustained way, especially those involving effort and delayed rewards. When you do something difficult, like working out, writing without distraction, or sitting in silence, your brain begins to reassociate dopamine release with the experience of exertion. This begins to reframe discomfort not as something to avoid, but as a cue that dopamine is being earned rather than given freely. Over time, this builds what could be called a disciplined brain, one that links effort with intrinsic motivation. This neural conditioning allows you to become more tolerant of boredom and discomfort and more focused on processes rather than outcomes. The dopamine system is not just about reward, it's also about anticipation and pursuit. When you remove easy rewards, your brain becomes more sensitive to natural dopamine surges that arise from challenge, making effort itself a desirable and motivating state. This shift is critical in cultivating lasting discipline and breaking the loop of compulsive, unproductive habits. Neurologically, this kind of discipline-building habit increases the density and strength of dopamine receptors in key areas of the brain, such as the striatum and prefrontal cortex. These changes create more efficient circuits for motivation, goal setting, and cognitive control. The result is not just feeling more disciplined, but actually becoming more neurologically capable of sustained focus and delayed gratification. Furthermore, this transformation is not a one-time event. It's a plastic, adaptive process that responds to repetition. The brain operates on the principle of use it or lose it, and every day you choose effort over ease, you are reinforcing pathways that support higher order thinking and reduced reactivity. You become better able to plan, resist temptation, and pursue long-term rewards. This kind of neural restructuring is not dramatic or immediate, but it compounds quietly over time, like compound interest in a savings account. Eventually, what once required conscious effort becomes automatic, and self-discipline becomes a default mode of operation rather than an exception. Another critical dimension of this practice is learning to experience effort as rewarding rather than as a barrier to reward. This mindset shift is not just psychological, it is also biochemical. The release of dopamine in response to challenge-based tasks rewires the brain to view exertion as meaningful. For example, when someone chooses to complete a hard workout instead of scrolling through their phone, their brain begins to pair the physical discomfort with the neurochemical satisfaction that follows. This type of feedback loop becomes increasingly self-reinforcing. The more effort you put into a task without seeking external validation or instant rewards, the more your brain learns to associate that internal struggle with a deeply satisfying, lasting form of dopamine release. This type of dopamine is less volatile, more sustainable, and far more conducive to long-term behavior change. The more you train this system, the more your capacity for self-directed action increases, creating a snowball effect that builds deep, authentic discipline. In contrast, individuals who rely on passive forms of stimulation often find themselves unable to engage deeply with any task that requires prolonged effort. Their dopamine system becomes accustomed to short-term spikes with little effort, creating a kind of neurochemical laziness. This isn't a moral failure, it's a physiological one. The key to reversing this is not guilt or shame, but recalibration. By choosing a single, meaningful habit that demands attention, effort, and presence, you start the process of retraining your reward circuitry. The habit itself is less important than its consistency and the level of discomfort it involves. Whether it's exercise, journaling, focused work, or cold exposure, the aim is to rewire the system so that your brain learns to crave challenge over ease. This process starts slowly, often with resistance or even aversion, but over time it becomes deeply satisfying in ways that fast dopamine never can. In short, the path to discipline is not paved with motivation, but with neurochemical restructuring through repeated, effortful behavior. Importantly, the habit doesn't need to be extreme or heroic to be effective. What matters most is that it introduces friction, a slight resistance that you voluntarily overcome each day. That moment of overcoming, no matter how small, is what trains the brain to link effort with a neurochemical reward. This is where the real rewiring happens. Each time you overcome the urge to avoid discomfort, you're reinforcing the dopaminergic pathways that make future effort easier. This is why many people report that their most disciplined periods come after routines that include some form of consistent, effort-based habit. They're not experiencing a surge of willpower. They're experiencing the benefits of a better-tuned dopamine system. Over time, the brain becomes less reactive to distractions and more tuned in to deep work and intentional living. This creates a kind of mental gravity, an internal pull toward behaviors that build and sustain purpose. The nervous system, in essence, becomes calibrated for discipline, not by resisting dopamine, but by regulating how and when it is earned. This neurobiological feedback loop is one of the most empowering mechanisms we have for behavioral change. Rather than chasing motivation, which is fleeting and unreliable, the focus shifts to consistency and reward system management. This is a form of agency that operates below conscious awareness once it's established. The disciplined individual isn't more motivated than others. They've just tuned their brain to find effort rewarding rather than aversive. That tuning takes time and repetition, but it is accessible to anyone, regardless of their background or current habits. The key is to start with one habit that requires daily commitment and low-level discomfort. Over time, this will build the scaffolding for additional changes as the brain becomes more capable of tolerating and even seeking out the types of challenges that drive growth. When effort becomes its own reward, discipline becomes not a struggle, but a source of joy and pride. This shift also allows you to break free from the endless cycle of needing novelty to feel alive or engaged. Instead of bouncing from one dopamine hit to another, your nervous system becomes resilient, stable, and purposeful. You can sit with stillness, focus through distraction, and delay gratification without feeling deprived. These are not just character traits, they are neurochemical outcomes of how your habits shape your brain. The reward system is constantly being sculpted by your actions, whether you're aware of it or not. This is why intentional habits that prioritize effort over ease are so powerful. They put you back in the driver's seat of your neurobiology. Rather than being a victim of your impulses, you become someone who generates motivation from within. That's real power. That's the root of discipline, and it's available to anyone who chooses to train their brain through deliberate action and consistent practice. In conclusion, the ability to maintain discipline in the face of distraction, discomfort, or delay is a direct result of how you manage your brain's reward system. When you rely on low-effort sources of dopamine, you weaken your drive and attention over time. But when you earn dopamine through hard, meaningful action, you strengthen the very circuits that support long-term focus and motivation. This is not just a theory, it's a biological reality. By aligning your habits with this understanding, you begin to rewire your brain for true self-control. You stop needing external pressure to act and start generating internal drive from systems you've built yourself. This is the essence of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to adapt based on experience. The more intentional the experience, the more powerful the transformation. Discipline, then, is not about force, it's about design. And the design begins with one single habit, repeated daily, with effort, purpose, and presence. Discipline is not an abstract concept or an inherited trait. It's a skill constructed by your brain through repetition and neural adaptation. Every time you make a difficult choice in favor of a long-term goal, you activate and strengthen specific pathways in your brain. These circuits, particularly those within the prefrontal cortex, are responsible for self-control, decision-making, and focus. When you consistently practice self-discipline, these neural connections grow stronger and more efficient, making it easier to choose focus over distraction in the future. In contrast, when you consistently choose comfort or immediate gratification, different circuits dominate. One's associated with impulsivity and short-term reward. Your brain doesn't care about what's right. It adapts to whatever you practice most. This means your habits are not just behavioral, they're biological. Your brain physically changes in response to what you do repeatedly. Through this lens, repetition becomes the most powerful tool for building inner strength. Every action becomes a vote toward the kind of brain you're creating. This process of strengthening neural circuits through action is known as experience-dependent plasticity. It's the foundation of all learning and behavior change. The brain is not static, it's malleable, constantly reshaping itself based on the patterns of thought and behavior you engage in. If you repeatedly override the impulse to give in, whether it's skipping a workout, avoiding a difficult task, or staying up too late, you are effectively carving a deeper path in your neural landscape. That path becomes easier to follow the next time and the time after that. You don't have to feel motivated. The act of doing is what builds the structure for discipline. Each repetition reinforces the signal that says, this is how we behave now. It's not about perfection, it's about consistency. Missing one day won't undo the process, but returning to the pattern as soon as possible is critical. The more often you return to the hard thing, the more natural it becomes. Eventually, what once felt like resistance starts to feel like rhythm. When you begin to repeat disciplined actions daily, your brain starts to make those actions more automatic. This is because the brain favors efficiency. It doesn't want to waste energy re-evaluating decisions that you've already made repeatedly. So when you show up every day at the same time to do something effortful, whether it's training, writing, meditating, or studying, your brain starts building a neural shortcut. These shortcuts, often referred to as habits, allow you to perform challenging tasks with less internal negotiation. You're no longer having the mental debate between doing it or not doing it. The behavior becomes default. This is the point where discipline becomes a kind of freedom. It no longer feels like a daily uphill battle. Instead, it feels like part of who you are. But that identity is not just psychological, it's encoded in the structure and function of your neural networks. The repetition doesn't just change your behavior, it reshapes the architecture of your brain to support that behavior. This is why discipline often starts as friction but transforms into flow. At first, you're pushing against resistance, both psychological and neurological. Your brain may signal discomfort, boredom, or even pain, especially if it's used to easier rewards. But repetition changes that. The circuits for effort and focus become stronger, while the circuits for avoidance and procrastination begin to weaken through disuse. Eventually, your brain stops seeing effort as a threat and begins to interpret it as familiar. This is a key moment in the transformation process. When your nervous system no longer sounds the alarm in the face of discomfort, you begin to gain access to deeper reserves of attention and energy. The process becomes less emotionally taxing. You spend less time battling yourself and more time immersed in meaningful action. The discipline that once felt like struggle now feels like alignment. But that alignment is only possible because of what you've built beneath the surface, through deliberate repetition and structured behavior. Every time you resist an impulse or delay gratification, you activate top-down control systems in your brain. These systems rely on communication between the prefrontal cortex and subcortical regions that govern emotions and urges. Repeated use of these circuits leads to more robust communication and stronger inhibitory control. This is the core of self-discipline, your ability to pause, reflect, and choose action over reaction. At first, this process may feel exhausting. The cognitive load of making difficult choices is real, but just like lifting weights, the more you train this system, the more efficient it becomes. You develop what could be called cognitive stamina, the ability to sustain effort over longer periods without collapsing into distraction or quitting. This isn't magic, it's biology. You're literally building stronger mental muscles. And over time, these muscles allow you to approach challenges with calm, focus, and resilience. The repetition of restraint becomes a source of strength rather than depletion. An important part of this process is emotional reconditioning. Discipline is often uncomfortable because it clashes with short-term emotional desires, but repetition allows you to pair effortful actions with positive emotional outcomes over time. When you consistently finish tasks, overcome resistance, or meet small milestones, your brain starts to associate those actions with satisfaction and pride. This emotional reinforcement strengthens the likelihood that you'll repeat the behavior. Over time, you begin to crave the internal rewards of consistency more than the external pleasures of avoidance. This shift doesn't happen in a single moment. It emerges slowly, as each repeated action builds a new emotional reference point. You no longer dread the work, you look forward to the feeling you get after doing it. That emotional memory is powerful. It guides future behavior more effectively than logic alone. This is how discipline becomes internalized, not just as something you do, but as something you feel compelled to maintain. Repetition also impacts your sense of identity. When you perform disciplined behaviors regularly, your self-perception begins to shift. You no longer see yourself as someone who struggles with consistency. You begin to see yourself as someone who shows up, even when it's hard. This identity is reinforced through action. The more often you act in alignment with discipline, the more your brain encodes that identity as real. Identity is not static. It's shaped by behavior. When your actions and self-emotion align, discipline becomes easier to maintain. There's less internal resistance because your brain sees this as your normal. You're no longer trying to be someone else, you're just being yourself. This alignment between action and identity is one of the most sustainable forms of motivation. It doesn't require constant reminders or external rewards. It's intrinsic. It comes from knowing that every repetition is a reflection of who you've chosen to become. It's essential to remember that the power of repetition lies in its ability to compound over time. Just like physical training doesn't yield results overnight, neither does mental training. But if you stick with the process, showing up every day, even in small ways, the neural changes accumulate. What starts as effort eventually becomes efficiency. What feels forced eventually becomes familiar. The key is to trust the process, especially in the early stages when results are not immediately visible. Your brain is changing even when you can't feel it. The circuits are forming, the habits are wiring, and the identity is taking shape. The discipline you build today lays the groundwork for the resilience and clarity you'll experience months or years from now. There is no wasted effort in this process. Every repetition counts. Even when progress feels slow, your brain is adapting in the background, preparing you for higher levels of challenge and purpose. Ultimately, repetition is not just a technique for behavior change, it is the foundation of transformation. The brain is designed to learn through consistent input, and discipline is one of the most powerful outputs of that design. When you repeat a behavior that challenges you, supports your goals, and aligns with your values, you are not just practicing discipline, you are becoming disciplined. This transformation is physical, emotional, and cognitive. It affects how you think, how you feel, and how you act. And once the transformation begins, it creates a positive feedback loop. The more disciplined you are, the easier it is to continue being disciplined. Repetition isn't glamorous. It's often quiet, uncelebrated, and difficult. But it is the secret to lasting change. The way you begin your day has a profound impact on how your brain and body function for the rest of it. When you choose to introduce discomfort early, you signal to your nervous system that stress is something to be mastered, not avoided. This choice conditions your mind to respond to challenge with focus instead of resistance. Whether it's through exercise, cold exposure, deep work, or another demanding activity, voluntary effort first thing in the morning activates systems responsible for alertness, motivation, and resilience. These systems don't just turn on temporarily, they set a tone that persists for hours. When you push through early resistance, you calibrate your brain to see effort not as friction, but as fuel. This mental framing transforms how you engage with tasks throughout the day. Instead of avoiding difficulty, your mind is prepared to meet it. Each decision to lean into morning discomfort becomes a neurological training session for discipline and mental toughness. What you do in the first hour of waking directly influences your brain's neurochemical balance. At that time, levels of cortisol, your body's natural alertness hormone, are already elevated. This is not a stress response to be feared. It's nature's way of preparing you for action. If you pair that biological readiness with an intentional challenge, you reinforce your ability to function under pressure. The circuits involved in focus, planning, and emotional regulation are most malleable early in the day, making them highly responsive to the type of stimulus you introduce. By choosing something uncomfortable but purposeful, you train those systems to associate intensity with clarity rather than overwhelm. Over time, this reshapes your emotional relationship with effort. What once triggered avoidance now signals opportunity. This shift is not just mental, it's physical. Your brain adapts by strengthening the pathways that manage stress and reward. The result is a nervous system that becomes more efficient at staying calm and focused when others spiral into distraction or fatigue. Introducing intentional discomfort at the beginning of the day also teaches you how to generate your own internal drive. Most people rely on external stimuli like caffeine, notifications, or social media to feel alert or motivated. But when you build the habit of choosing challenge upon waking, you condition your brain to activate these motivational circuits internally. The reward becomes the act of effort itself, not what you receive afterward. This is a crucial distinction. If your sense of drive is always dependent on rewards, you'll struggle when outcomes are delayed or uncertain. But if your nervous system learns to associate effort with a sense of purpose or satisfaction, you can maintain forward momentum even when circumstances don't provide instant gratification. This gives you a deep sense of autonomy because motivation no longer depends on mood, environment, or results. You know how to generate it from within. This makes you less reactive, more deliberate, and far more consistent in pursuing long-term goals. Deliberate discomfort in the morning isn't about punishing yourself. It's about activating systems that regulate attention and action. Activities like high-intensity movement, breath work, or even exposure to cold can engage the brainstem and midbrain regions that control wakefulness and focus. These regions also help suppress the default mode network, a part of the brain associated with mind wandering and rumination. When you disrupt passive brain states early with intense goal-directed behavior, you're effectively telling your system this is not a day for drift, this is a day for direction. As this becomes a pattern, your brain begins to anticipate a more energized and intentional rhythm to each day. You don't just feel more disciplined, you become more neurologically optimized for disciplined behavior. That mental clarity and resilience persist well beyond the morning, influencing how you make decisions, manage emotions, and respond to unforeseen challenges. All of it starts with one small voluntary challenge first thing in the morning. Another powerful outcome of embracing friction early is that it inoculates you against emotional volatility later in the day. Most people experience dips in motivation or focus when stress accumulates or when tasks become difficult. But if you've already experienced controlled discomfort early, your brain has a reference point. It knows you've handled worse already. This creates what could be called emotional resilience memory. It's a stored signal that says, I've faced stress and remained in control. This signal calms your nervous system during high-pressure moments, allowing you to approach problems with clarity rather than panic. In a world that constantly throws new obstacles, this ability to remain steady is invaluable. And it's not built through theory or positive thinking. It's earned through morning friction. That early discomfort becomes your training ground, a space where you rehearse your capacity to endure and act deliberately. The benefits compound, showing up in every decision you make, every reaction you regulate, and every challenge you confront later in the day. Voluntary morning discomfort also teaches your brain the difference between real threat and perceived effort. Many modern-day stress responses are triggered not by danger but by inconvenience or delay. When you routinely subject yourself to something physically or mentally challenging each morning, your brain recalibrates its threat detection systems. It starts to see effort as a signal for engagement, not danger. This makes you less likely to overreact to frustration, less prone to procrastination, and more likely to lean into your responsibilities. Over time, you develop a kind of calm aggressiveness, an ability to act without needing to feel ready. This doesn't eliminate stress, but it changes how your system interprets it. Instead of retreating from pressure, you learn to move through it. That's not just a mindset shift, it's a rewiring of your entire stress response system. You're teaching your brain to remain focused under load, and that change affects everything from your productivity to your emotional stability. The discipline you cultivate through early day discomfort also enhances your ability to make better decisions. When you start your day with something difficult, you practice delaying gratification right away. That delay strengthens the same circuits used in long-term planning and self-regulation. You begin to notice subtle but powerful changes. You reach for water instead of caffeine. You pause before reacting emotionally. You choose to finish tasks instead of avoiding them. These are not isolated behaviors. They are downstream effects of a nervous system trained to manage tension instead of flee from it. Morning discomfort acts like a sharpening tool, refining your ability to separate what feels good from what is good. It creates a mental space between impulse and action where deliberate choice can take root. Over time, this space grows, and with it, your capacity to live in alignment with your highest goals rather than your momentary moods. That alignment is the essence of sustainable discipline. There's also a psychological benefit to knowing you've already done something hard before most people have even begun their day. This knowledge provides a kind of quiet confidence, a foundational win that builds momentum. When you face the first discomfort intentionally and succeed, you shift into a mindset of control and agency. That confidence carries forward into every interaction and challenge, acting as a buffer against anxiety and distraction. You're not hoping the day goes well. You're setting the tone. The act of choosing discomfort becomes an act of reclaiming power over your own biology. Instead of being pulled by convenience or external pressure, you're led by intention, and that sense of control is deeply stabilizing. It anchors you to your purpose and frees you from the endless search for motivation or ideal conditions. The simple fact that you began the day with discipline becomes evidence that you can handle whatever comes next. The beauty of this process is that it doesn't require dramatic change. The discomfort can be small, a cold shower, 5 minutes of breath work, or simply doing your most avoided task first. What matters is the intention and consistency. You're not waiting for the day to shape you. You're shaping the day with action. And with each repetition, your brain learns that challenge is not only tolerable, it's desirable. That shift rewires your motivations at the root level. You become someone who seeks out growth instead of comfort, someone who defines success by effort rather than outcome. That kind of mindset doesn't happen by accident. It's earned through daily choices, through brief windows of discomfort that forge lasting mental resilience. The morning becomes a proving ground, not just for your body or schedule, but for your character. And when practiced consistently, that habit creates a neurological and psychological foundation for discipline that no setback can easily shake. Every decision you make is preceded by a moment, a small space where you can choose either action or inaction. It is in this space that momentum is built or lost. When you learn to act within that short window, especially when you feel resistance, you begin to create a shift in how your brain processes urgency and hesitation. The mind is wired to seek efficiency, and over time, it labels hesitation as safety. But when you take immediate action, even in the presence of doubt or discomfort, you teach your nervous system that movement is safe and productive. This action doesn't have to be perfect, it just needs to happen. By eliminating the delay between thought and action, you strip away the internal friction that keeps people stuck. The more often you act without overthinking, the faster you override the circuits responsible for procrastination. Eventually, that reflex to wait is replaced by a new reflex, to start. The brain is highly responsive to patterns, especially those involving perceived risk and effort. When you hesitate, your brain begins to build associations between action and anxiety. That association gets stronger every time you avoid something difficult, but the opposite is also true. When you consistently take action before your mind talks you out of it, your brain learns that effort leads to reward, not fear. You start to desensitize your system to the discomfort of beginning. That initial discomfort is often exaggerated by anticipation, not reality. The moment you start moving, your physiology shifts. Adrenaline rises, focus sharpens, and the problem becomes manageable. The key is not giving your brain time to spiral into analysis or excuse making. Action becomes the tool that interrupts the cycle of doubt. In time, the very sensation of resistance becomes a cue not to stop, but to go. You recondition your nervous system to treat hesitation as a call for action. This practice rewires not just your decision-making process, but your identity. Every time you act in spite of doubt, you reinforce a belief: I am someone who follows through. This belief becomes the foundation for discipline, because it's no longer dependent on motivation or emotion. Instead of waiting to feel ready, you trust the process of starting. That trust builds integrity with yourself. You begin to believe your own word because you see the evidence in your behavior. This changes how you approach every area of your life: work, health, relationships, and creativity. You no longer feel like a passenger waiting for the right mood or energy. You feel like the driver, capable of creating momentum through action. That sense of control feeds back into your system, reinforcing the circuits responsible for confidence and consistency. And each repetition adds more weight to your identity as someone who acts rather than delays. It's important to understand that most people never train this micro skill, the skill of acting in the space between thought and doubt. They wait until they feel certain, confident, or comfortable. But those moments rarely arrive on their own. Certainty is not a prerequisite for action. It is a byproduct of it. The moment you begin, the brain starts gathering data. This isn't as bad as I imagined. That data reduces fear, builds familiarity, and creates a positive feedback loop. When you train yourself to act in the face of discomfort, you are disrupting the fear loop with evidence. You prove to yourself that hesitation is often a false alarm. Over time, this recalibration becomes automatic. Your brain doesn't go into freeze mode as easily because it's used to being directed rather than indulged. Action becomes the form of mental training. Every time you move without waiting, you deepen the neural groove of decisiveness and weaken the habit of paralysis. Even a few seconds of delay can make the difference between action and avoidance. That's why the speed of initiation matters so much. The longer you wait, the more opportunity you give your limbic system, the part of your brain responsible for emotional response, to intervene with fear, excuses, or distractions. But when you move immediately, you bypass that interference. Once you start, momentum takes over. You don't need to see the whole path, you just need to move forward by one step. That step signals commitment, and commitment activates systems in your brain related to persistence and reward. Action produces clarity. It creates its own energy. In contrast, waiting depletes energy and magnifies anxiety. When you realize that the hardest part is starting, everything else becomes simpler. Action breaks inertia, and inertia is often the biggest enemy of progress. This principle applies across disciplines and domains. Whether you're trying to write, exercise, have a difficult conversation, or break a bad habit, the ability to move in that initial moment defines your trajectory. The situation may vary, but the rule remains. Hesitation weakens, action strengthens. This doesn't mean reckless movement. It means intentional forward motion, even in small increments. A single push-up, a few words on a blank page, or picking up the phone. These micro intentions trigger larger outcomes. They signal to the brain that the task is underway, which prompts the release of chemicals like dopamine and norepinephrine. These neurochemicals help sustain attention and effort. But they're not triggered by thinking, they're triggered by movement. You can't intellectualize your way into action.